Good afternoon, and welcome to our panel, Partnering with Patients Strengthens Science. I'm Tanya Simoncelli. I'm the Vice President of Science and Society at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I'm so thrilled to be back in Aspen. Last time I was here was 2019, and it's just one of my absolutely favorite places in the country. Such beautiful scenery and such a great setting to have these conversations. At CZI, at Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, we believe that patients are powerful drivers of biomedical research. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here to moderate this panel this afternoon, where we're going to be talking about some of the extraordinary ways that patients are mobilizing their communities and accelerating research and driving change across the health research ecosystem. I have four really fabulous panelists with me on this panel. I'm so delighted to introduce them, and then we'll dig in and have some conversation. First, we have Josh Sommer. Josh is the co-founder and executive director of the Chordoma Foundation. With a sense of urgency prompted by his own chordoma diagnosis, Josh has spent the last 15 years building a global movement of patients, doctors, and researchers to drive progress toward better treatments, care, and patient experience. Next to Josh is Sneha Dave, who is the founder and executive director of Generation Patient and its program, the Crohn's and Colitis Young Adults Network, where she works to empower and create support systems for adolescents and young adults with chronic and rare conditions across the United States and internationally. Third, next to Sneha, we have Vivian Nabetta, who's the founder and executive director of the Sonia Nabetta Foundation. The foundation works to improve access to healthcare for children with type 1 diabetes in Africa, to educate children with type 1 diabetes, and to create a community that has accessible and affordable healthcare with supportive and stigma-free communities for people with type 1 diabetes across Africa. And finally is Alison Sprana, who is a patient researcher with a patient-led research collaborative and a disability activist living with myalgic encephalomyelitis and other chronic diseases caused by a 2014 viral infection. Alison is passionate about bringing her lived experience to the table in healthcare, research, and public policy circles, and is a patient experience expert for the CDC-funded Long COVID and Fatiguing Illness Recovery Program. So with that introduction, welcome everybody. So thrilled that you're all here with us today. I wanted to start because each of you comes, nobody plans to be a patient leader. And each of you come to your work from very different lived experiences and different circumstances. And so I was wondering, I would love for you each to take a couple of minutes to tell us a little bit about your organization and what brought you to this work. Why don't we start? We can just go down the line, or we can go the other way. Alison, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think my story is, my personal story really informs what I do here. So April 7th, 2014, I was a healthy, active, young college student, and I was actually a classical musician, and I was performing, and I had the first symptoms of my virus. And from April 7th, 2014 on, my life was changed forever because I developed myalgic encephalomyelitis and other chronic conditions from that virus. The next 8 years until today was a confusing journey of symptoms that are fluctuating, unpredictable, and largely invisible, like fatigue and pain, headaches, tachycardia, dizziness, and so many more. So it was a difficult journey for me to get diagnosed and to seek care. There are no FDA-approved treatments for people with myalgic encephalomyelitis. And 2019 and 2020, I participated in a clinical trial at the NIH, an observational study on my disease. I returned home February 13th, 2020, and shortly after, the world shut down, and I saw what was coming with long COVID. My whole community did, because many of us had become disabled by a virus ourselves many years before. And so I got involved with Body Politic, which was a grassroots long COVID group that formed to tell the stories of people who had unpredictable long recoveries of COVID-19 in the beginning. Got involved in May 2020. And that support group that Body Politic created as a grassroots response, out of that, There were people with long COVID who were biomedical researchers, who were public policy experts, who had backgrounds in machine learning and all kinds of research. They came together in our group, formed the Patient-Led Research Collaborative, and put out the first paper on long COVID in May of 2020. Again, published a preprint in December 2020, which was then peer-reviewed in July 2021, published in The Lancet. And so the rest is history. Now I've become a lived experience expert in post-viral illnesses and speak to that now and help inform the research on it.
Yeah, no, my name is Vivian Nabetta, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be amongst these panelists and then to be back in person. This is my first panel in person, so that's exciting. Let's just start there. But my name's Vivian Nabetta, and I came into this space, I guess, by accident. I'm an environmental engineer by training, and now I'm a global public health sort of person or expert, if you will. And my journey started in 2000. My sister had type 1 diabetes for 16 years, and at the age of 24, she suddenly succumbed to hypoglycemic attack. And sort of my life was turned upside down. One minute you're speaking to her, the next it's gone. And so it was sort of a moment of what is going on here. And my family's from Uganda. So, you know, slowly poking around, trying to figure out what intervention needed to be done so that my sister's short life wasn't in vain. It was apparent. Type 1 diabetes is a rare condition in the context of Africa. No one is prioritizing it. Data is poor. The reality of the matter is that there were partners on the continent working for 20 years and the outcomes were still poor. So what are the gaps? You know, we needed to come together on a patient-led agenda, you know, listen to what patients are saying and build a program, an initiative, an organization that is basically delivering for them. Is it more research? Is it, you know, access issues that you need to work around? And so that was, you know, my journey to here. And so here I am, an advocate for, you know, patients, organize yourselves. Otherwise, especially if you have a condition in your, you know, that you believe is a rare condition, you have to step in front of it. And I think you'll hear that from a lot of these wonderful folk.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis when I was 6 years old. And ulcerative colitis is a form of an inflammatory bowel disease. So, you know, I've been sick basically my entire life. I don't know what it feels like to quote unquote live in a healthy body. But during my freshman year of high school, I had the colectomy surgery, which is the removal of my large intestine. And I've had sort of major surgeries after. But as I was transitioning from pediatric into adult care, I noticed that there were so many things that our systems, whether that was medical, you know, or higher education, employment, there were just so many different things that were really heavily underaddressed as I was transitioning into independence. And so when you look at a young adult patient, you know, as I mentioned, there's employment, education, but there's also this identity piece. And really, how does that form as we're, you know, entering adulthood as independent or, you know, potentially independent adults, and how does that kind of play into who we are as people? And so at Generation Patient, we're actually entirely Gen Z patient-led nonprofit. And so we are one of the only, if not the only, organizations focusing exclusively on adolescent and young adult patients, which again are heavily underrepresented within a lot of talks about chronic illness, you know, disability spaces. And so kind of the programming that we do, so we host about 7 peer support meetings per month. We've done a little over 250 over the last 2 years. We do a variety of work in higher education, so increasing access and retention of chronically ill students within higher education. And then we also do a variety of policy work, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that from the kind of the regulatory standpoint and what it means to engage as a grassroots organization that's independent and entirely young adult patient-led.
Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Summer. Continuing along with the theme, I'm also here because of an unexpected diagnosis. In my case, it was a very unusual form of cancer called chordoma, which I was diagnosed with during my freshman year of college. Actually, this morning, as I was on the hike, hearing about how the Rockies were formed and how they were carved by glaciers, it occurred to me that chordoma is kind of like the glacier of cancers in that it is very slow but unstoppable. So the problem with chordoma is it tends to come back, and when it does come back, there's really no effective therapy or cure. So at 18, I was kind of faced with these odds of maybe a 1 in 3 chance of this tumor not coming back, and facing a long, tough journey if it did. So those odds did not sit well, and I became determined to try to do anything in my power to change them. Through maybe good fortune, it turned out that the only federally funded chordoma researcher at the time actually was at Duke, where I was studying, which just provided this incredible opportunity to kind of go into the lab and try to do something firsthand to solve this problem. Before long, it became clear that one lab could only do so much, that there was going to be a whole lot of additional expertise, many more researchers and companies that would need to bring to bear their expertise on this disease. And so to do that, there were a whole bunch of things that needed to be in place. Researchers needed to have access to the basic materials to study, tumor tissues, cell lines, animal models. None of these things existed. There was no research network. There was no coordination or collaboration among researchers. It's fortuitous that Dr. Collins is here in the audience, because it was actually a meeting that we had in his office in December of 2006 that really was a turning point for us. And Dr. Collins and colleagues at the NIH very graciously agreed to work with us to put together the very first International Chordoma Research Workshop, which was this really turning point moment for the field of chordoma research. It allowed us to bring together a research community for the first time to identify research priorities. And that has really guided us for the last 15 years. Many of the things that were identified at that first research workshop, it became very evident that they weren't going to solve themselves. They weren't going to happen without an entity, an organization, a quarterback, if you will, driving them forward and making sure that they happen. And so that's what we've been doing for the last 15 years with the Chordoma Foundation, building a research ecosystem, proactively funding research, organizing the patient community to participate in research. And thankfully, we've seen that when those pieces come together, when you build a functional research ecosystem, incredible things can happen. We've got 7 clinical trials. Patients are benefiting on those trials now. So I feel a lot more hope now than I did 15 years ago, but still a lot more work to do.
Right.
It's amazing. So as I sit and listen to each of your stories, one of the common threads is how each of you have worked to mobilize your communities in different ways, in slightly different ways, and for slightly different purposes. And yet none of you were trained in community organizing, I don't think. Alison, you were a musician. Vivian, you were an engineer, right? Environmental engineer. Sneha, you were so young, like it's just extraordinary, like in and of itself. Josh, you were a freshman in college when you were diagnosed. It's just amazing. Like, what gave you the courage, and what made you realize, like Josh, your story about you organized not just the patient community, but the research community. Like, I mean, you realized in part from being in the lab and realizing it was so hard to study the disease, but what gave each of you the courage to take the plunge, to do something that there's not really a roadmap for? And how did you decide what particular challenge in your disease area to focus on, and what are one of the accomplishments that you would point to and that you're most proud of, in either yourself or the organization that you're working with?
I guess I'll take that. I'll jump in to the deep end. I think from my perspective, there's no way my sister left at 24 years old and nothing happens. I needed to make meaning of that. So that was the #1 motivation. And then at the time, I was still at the UN. I had a fancy job. It's so secure and everything. And so with the foundation, when we started it, it was like, you know, go to Uganda, a couple camps, you know, hand over candy for 4 days, you walk away. But in doing that, because we were using, you know, when we do the camps, you're basically finding people's stories, gathering data. You're like, what's happening here? There's a need, an urgent need for something to happen, because right now they're dying. And so I think starting to put faces to, you know, the condition when we started, yeah, that's literally what started everything. And in the SNF ecosystem, my organization's ecosystem, we actually developed the concept of, you know, a person living with type 1 diabetes is called a warrior. And so we realized very quickly a term of empowerment was good in terms of removing stigma. And you'll be hard-pressed right now, especially in Uganda and potentially Ghana, to actually find somebody with type 1 diabetes who does not refer to themselves as a warrior or anybody connected to the condition. So they know this is them, and it's really helped and motivated the community to organize, to stay connected, because in the end, in order for me to, run this organization and program appropriately what it is that they want, they have got to be organized. They have got to feel like they're an important partner on this agenda. Otherwise, we're doing nothing. And so that's basically my little story there.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, as far as motivation, I guess there's a little bit of kind of a sword of Damocles situation. Certainly, the prospect of tumor coming back and not having effective treatments provides the motivation. But I think that coupled with an understanding that I got in the lab, that in fact with the right knowledge and with the right, matched with the right medicine, there's no reason to believe that essentially every disease can't be solvable. And I don't think that I realized that previously, and I still don't know that really that sinks in for everyone. So we know how to generate knowledge. We have the scientific method. It's just a matter of being able to do research fast enough to operate, to match the sense of urgency that patients feel. So I was also studying environmental engineering. And so for me, this became an engineering problem. How do we make research move faster? What are all the inputs that are needed? What are the impediments that, that affect the pace of research? And how can we systematically attack them? It became clear that there were a lot of things that needed to be done, a lot of problems that needed to be solved, a lot of infrastructure that needed to be built, that no single researcher had either the capability nor the incentive to build. And so it kind of demanded an organization driven by patients that, that had an incentive, that had no choice but to solve these problems. Right. And it wasn't being done. And so, I think it created a calling.
Alison, how about you? You went from being a musician to
being
doing this
disabled by
incredible work, though.
Yeah.
And despite that, doing incredible work to mobilize a community that now, and now again with COVID and long COVID. What gave you the courage to do that? Like to take the plunge, to move from your training as a musician? And how do you feel like your training as a musician was helpful?
Yeah, so the main motivator for me at the beginning of the pandemic, so I had been sick for 6 years at this point, and I had experienced a really immense level of suffering. One of the key features of myalgic encephalomyelitis, and unfortunately now long COVID, is something called post-exertion malaise. What that means essentially is after you exert yourself, this could be mental, physical, you crash. It feels like you have the flu. So I often describe it to reporters as a customized form of torture, because imagine a disease where you do literally anything. You could be laying in bed and thinking, and you can crash from that. You can have symptoms like fevers, fatigue, sore throat, headache, pain, brought on just by exerting yourself in that way. It causes a very terrible level of suffering that we experience. And then on top of that, it was really difficult to navigate the medical system, the system of government benefits, of disability, and all of that. Try to figure out, can I work with this condition? Spoiler alert, I was not able to, and I applied for Social Security disability, and that was really challenging too. And so the underlying motivator for me at the beginning of the pandemic is I have suffered so much. It was sort of like a Viktor Frankl-esque, I have to make meaning out of my suffering, and I wish someone had paved this path for me before, so I'm going to do it for them. And so that's what I did when I reached out to Body Politic, is I saw myself as like helping teach the next generation of disabled people from long COVID. And also, I'm only one person living with myalgic encephalomyelitis, living with this disability. There's so much wisdom in the entire disability and chronic illness community. So let me connect those two groups together. So these thousands of people with long COVID can learn from those communities.
I love that. Go ahead, Snana.
Yeah. So, there's about 20 million young adults with chronic conditions. And I think that fact often goes really undernoticed. Another really powerful statistic is that young adults with chronic conditions are 363% more likely to attempt suicide. And what that means for someone who's growing up, who's like in a body that is full of pain and you can't control so much of what's happening outside. That can be very, very isolating. So I know for myself, when I was in high school, I was in a period of isolation for about 5 years due to the severity of my condition. And so just really being able to find community for myself, I started in Indiana, and then we slowly kind of grew from there. And I think that's one thing that we cannot forget, is that while we are waiting for a cure, while we are waiting for novel therapeutics, we cannot forget the quality of life, the peer support that we need very desperately. And so, while it's critical that we're focusing on research, we're investing in that, we also need to make sure that those of us who are here right now, who have lived with, I've lived with colitis for 18 years, I'm 24 now, what that means for me long term, and really to be able to have that network is why, I created Generation Patient, and why our team has led this to, grow so much, and why we, remain really passionate about bringing together this next generation of patients.
That's great. Each of you has touched on some of the big challenges, navigating systems, underserved systems, not meeting the needs of patients day to day. Researchers, I don't know if you said this, Josh, but I know your story. Researchers working in silos, needing to break down those silos. Basically, infrastructure that's lacking to actually even study a disease when it's very rare, for example. The need to, Alison, you were dealing with a brand new disease, right? That needs to be characterized, and the power of the patient community in helping to do that is just extraordinary example of why I think patient communities are so important in driving research. And we can talk all day about the challenges because there's so many, but I want you to each talk a little bit about, one of the achievements or two of the achievements of your organizations that you're most proud of. You've each been at this at different lengths of time, but you're doing extraordinary work. What do you think, when you look back at the last few years of what you've been doing, what really stands out as a real achievement of your community, and why was the voice of the patient so essential in achieving that?
Well, I'll go again. I think your eyes, catch mine, and then there I am. I think for sure the warrior community is like the most powerful thing that I'm extremely proud of, because, empowering them, educating them, and having them lead the mission is extraordinary. The second thing, and I think, data collection is very hard in the context of Africa. So understanding that it's not just about insulin, you shoot it in the arm or whatever, what is the whole child, what is the economic situation at home, what is, the data around the social determinants of health. So building a digital tool, we actually have it, and having that inform us on what's next, I think is probably the most important. And this started out with the camps, as I mentioned, but now we opened our first clinic in Ghana 3 weeks ago, June 3rd, and that's actually part of the protocol. You come in and you basically have all this data that we're collecting. So I think it's such an informational tool that I'm super excited about, and I think it's the reason why I'm even here today, because of the key piece of information that emerged out of that was that on average in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, we've done this in Uganda, Malawi, and Ghana, the data we collected, on average kids were round trip to the clinic 5.5 hours, and the majority of that was on foot. And so already that's a large access barrier, and I think in trying to figure out, when COVID happened, of course that exacerbated everything, but in trying to figure out how to solve this issue, that's how the Helmsley Trust found us, and together we put a project together that's sort of mitigating this issue of access. So I think those three things are probably the things that I'm like, okay, I'm on the right track. I did the right thing. Yeah.
If I could jump in, I think the thing that I'm most proud of with the Patient-Led Research Collaborative is, so we put the first paper out in May 2020 on long COVID. It wasn't even called long COVID. It was May 2020. The speed at which we organized was unprecedented. And I want to paint the picture for you. So this is a group of patient researchers from around the world who are working from their bed in between symptoms, recovering from COVID, sometimes can't even tolerate screens, right? And they're getting in a few hours here and there working on this research to understand the lived experience of their community that they now know because it has been happening in their own bodies. And then we put a paper out in May 2020. I think that speed sets a new precedent for the advantages of patient-led research, because it's not only the speed that was beneficial. What that paper did is it absolutely set the foundation for what our expectations were for long COVID, where the research priorities would go. And because that paper was grounded in the science that had come before long COVID on post-infectious illnesses like myalgic encephalomyelitis, it created the expectation from the beginning that we need to build on what we already know. It's not enough. There have only been a select few researchers operating on tiny budgets, but we can still build from their knowledge, and we ought to, because we have no time to waste to reinvent the wheel. That's definitely what I'm most proud of.
Yeah. And the urgency that you all bring to your stories and from the community, and the power of that is incredibly powerful. Who wants to go?
I'll go next, yes. So I think there's a couple of things that I'm most proud of. So first of all, I think, our incredible team, we have 3, staff members, including myself. So we're a very, very small team. And it wasn't until last year we were able to actually have paid staff. And I've actually been doing this since I was 13 years old. I created a newsletter in Indiana, and it sort of evolved into what Generation Patient is now. So I've been doing kind of a form of this advocacy for about 10 years. And it was really kind of out of a need for, just that connection as well. So we do a lot of work in higher education, as I mentioned, in peer support. We also have a lot of sort of programming in advanced care planning and civic engagement. But our higher education and peer support are 2 of our kind of big areas. And what I'm most proud of specifically with our higher education work is that we're kind of intersecting something that just has not been discussed enough. I mean, disability in higher education has very much been discussed, but thinking about dynamic disabilities, those disabilities that, you might not be able to see or might, present in very different ways on different days. And so just having that sort of advocacy arm and really ensuring that, again, while we're waiting for novel therapeutics or cures, whatever that might look like, that we have the opportunity to thrive in these systems that are just not built for us in a lot of ways. The second thing that I would say I'm really proud of us about is we just started working on policy/regulatory work this January. And it has been the most interesting and complex in a lot of ways as a patient to engage in a lot of these spaces which are not developed, again, for patients, to engage in firsthand. I mean, it is so complex with, even when we're talking about the user fees, most of you all might not know what the FDA user fees are, but these are things that really impact us day to day, and these are things that, it's mind-boggling that more patients and more patient communities are not involved in this. And so, one of the things that we're advocating for right now with the user fees, and we're kind of at the tail end of this legislation, is to increase enrollment targets of adolescents and young adults within clinical trials. So even within some, adult trials, can we include adolescents when we're talking about, conditions like IBD, Crohn's, and colitis. Another big issue is with the FDA adverse event reporting system. So, that was kind of built off of my own experiences having an adverse event to a medication that I took, and realizing that the FDA adverse event reporting system currently has 18 to 64-year-olds grouped in one category. And as all you can probably imagine, a body of an 18-year-old is very different than that of a 60 or 64-year-old. And so really trying to make sure that, if there's no one advocating for us, then we are really the people doing so. And, regulatory work is so important for patients, and I hope that we can find pathways so more of us can be involved in this sort of decision making.
That's great.
I think far and away the most gratifying part of all this is actually seeing patients benefit on the clinical trials that we've been able to initiate and support. I just actually caught up with a patient in the Netherlands who was completely out of options, had a rapidly progressing tumor, terrible quality of life, and he went on one of the clinical trials that we're supporting, and his life has completely changed. He's gotten hope back, his symptoms have improved, his tumor has shrunk. So seeing that science can actually change people's lives is incredible, and it adds more fuel to the fire. On the other hand, I've seen what it took to get that, to reach that point. It was 12 years of problem solving. First, even to get researchers to work on this concept, and then to be able to test the concept in animals, and then to be able to get a clinical trial going, and to be able to recruit patients for that trial, and raise money for the trial, it took way too long. We don't have 12 years. So we have to find ways to move faster. And so one of the things I'm most excited about now is that we've put in place a set of capabilities by starting our own lab that allows research to move significantly faster, more efficiently than has historically been possible in the world of academia and industry. And so that's the thing that I think gives me the most hope for the future, is that there's a whole set of research that just wasn't even possible that can now be done in the lab. We can do research completely untethered from the incentive structures of academia and industry. We're not beholden to that, and we can essentially take, control our own destiny to an extent. So very optimistic about what that's going to mean for accelerating the pace of progress going forward.
Yeah, that's great. This idea about the power of the patient community to overcome disincentives or to change incentive structures in disease areas, that's incredibly powerful story, I think, Josh, and something I've so admired in what you have done and what the Chordoma Foundation has done over the last 15 years. I'm wondering if that rings true to the other, to the rest of you, and that this idea of like, in what ways are the incentives misaligned in your disease areas, or is that something that your groups have worked on, or that you see as part of the role of your communities in trying to shift? Whoever wants to chime in, you don't all have to answer that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think one great example that is relevant to this, so our team at Patient-Led Research Collaborative has been working with PCORI on developing a scorecard for patients to evaluate how researchers are doing on their disease. And I think it's an accountability area that can help address this issue. And is a great example of what happens when you engage patients in meaningful research. And then it also gives a framework to actually evaluate and motivate researchers to be engaging in patients in a meaningful way, not in a tokenizing way. Because we want to be engaged in a meaningful way. We don't want to just be invited to the table to say, oh yeah, we had a patient there, and then we made all the decisions without them. The other thing I want to touch on here is the quality of life, because quality of life for people with long COVID, it's a real problem, especially when we don't have much to access or to offer them in terms of treatments, right? So we have to wait for research to move at the pace that it's moving, which is not fast enough, in order to have treatments to offer them. And so what can we do in the meantime? There are people who have been living with long COVID for 2.5 years at this point. How can we increase their quality of life? And are you measuring that in your research? I think it's another area that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, that's great. Did you want to say something, Sneh?
Yeah, I will. So, as I mentioned, we do cover all chronic and rare conditions, but our only disease-specific programming is the Crohn's and Colitis Young Adults Network. And one thing I think that's super interesting as it pertains to incentives and disincentives is the power of social media and really bringing to light what patients are looking for in a very urgent manner. So just to give you an example, in IBD, the Crohn's space, on Twitter, there's a huge push right now for bioelectronic medicine, for people like Dr. David Duncan at Mount Sinai, who's a pediatric gastroenterologist and who's currently testing traditional Chinese mushrooms. So stuff like that is so exciting because, for many of us, we have therapeutics in the IBD space. We have a long way to go for a cure, but at the same time, a lot of them are not safe. If I'm being honest, just from personal experience, I'm not going to say in a generalizable way, but just the safety of a lot of these therapeutics that we have is really scary for us as patients to think about. If I'm on one of my last treatment options for IBD, I'm 24, and I still have my entire life ahead of me, and I've had no short of adverse events. So how can we sort of utilize even social media? And I know body politic has been huge with that. But especially on Twitter, it's like, how can we, start investing? And one other thing is, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Josh, because I think, especially with the pharmaceutical industry, oftentimes it's really difficult to pitch the therapeutics that we actually want and actually need right now.
Yeah.
So some of you, sorry, Josh, did you want to add something?
Well, I was just going to build on that. I mean, I think one thing that was, has just been so eye-opening is that, the way that we organize research is not very intelligently designed. I mean, for the most part, research is done by individual researchers. And if you think about it, those individual researchers have very little incentive and oftentimes significant disincentive to create things that are going to be widely beneficial to other researchers. And so what that translates to, what that ends up meaning is that you see a huge lack of data sharing. You see a lack of sharing of critical resources. You see the same capabilities having to be built over and over and over again at a small scale, and you have very low experimental efficiency. And so I think that that makes sense from the standpoint of an individual investigator. But when you're a patient organization and when you have a singular mission of finding a cure as quickly as possible, that becomes unacceptable. You have a very different set of incentives. You have an incentive to create shared infrastructure and create things that are going to be broadly beneficial to the entire research community, to lower the barrier to entry to pharmaceutical companies, for example. And at the end of the day, pharmaceutical companies, they have to make money. And to expect otherwise is just unrealistic. So how do you, as a patient organization, a patient community, position your disease to be a viable business proposition for a pharmaceutical company? There's several ways to influence that. You can reduce the cost of developing drug in your disease. You can increase the potential market by demonstrating connections to other diseases. You can decrease the time that it takes. You can find ways to repurpose existing drugs. So there's all sorts of things that I think patients are uniquely, and patient organizations are uniquely incentivized to do, because we have the most skin in the game.
Right.
And so I think there's a huge opportunity, as CZI has done, to recognize that patient organizations can kind of significantly change the dynamic of what gets done in a particular research field.
Yeah, and the work is enormously challenging. One of the things we've learned, I think I'll ask one more question and then we'll open it up to the audience. So would love to hear your questions in a few minutes. One of the things we've learned at CZI, one of our largest programs within our Science and Society program is a patient-driven research program, and where we are actually directly funding patient-led organizations in the rare disease space to accelerate progress to work to accelerate progress in their disease areas. And we've deliberately created this as a network where we currently have 50 groups that we're funding, and we're not just providing them with funding, we're providing them with scientific and organizational capacity building support to do this work, and really working to learn from them as to what the challenges are and the opportunities for scaling different solutions in this space to all rare disease communities. And one of the findings of just like the last 3 years of doing this work is one of the things that's been so inspiring to me has been the network effect of this, that these groups are learning so much from one another. They're sharing tools, they're sharing strategies, they're sharing roadmaps, they're sharing, here's how you do drug repurposing. Where is that an effective strategy in what situations, or where is it not? And helping one another. And we started out talking about how you're each coming from different experiences and disciplines, and none of you plan to do this work, none of them either, but they're finding that collectively they're able to share their wisdom and experiences with one another, and there are synergies across these really different diseases. And I think we're already hearing that from each of you. But I'm wondering, this network effect and working with other groups, how have you worked and collaborated with other groups? Is that important in your work? And are there particular learnings you can share about the value of working with other patient communities? Alison, maybe start with you.
Sure. I think it's one of our biggest strengths at Patient-Led Research Collaborative because, like I said, before the pandemic, there was a foundational body of knowledge from post-viral illness experts. These are the few researchers around the country and around the world who had been working on myalgic encephalomyelitis and other post-viral conditions. And the fact that the Patient-Led Research Collaborative and our team at Body Politic, we were able to sort of reach over and connect with these groups who were working on myalgic encephalomyelitis, mast cell activation syndrome, dysautonomia, all of these patient groups who had experienced severe disease following infections, bring them all together and then have us all benefit from it and move us all forward together. Even though we technically don't have the same disease, it was foundational to the work that we do.
Yeah, that's great.
I definitely, I mean, transferable experience from whatever, I think is always invaluable. And I think from my perspective, you know, I'm out here with a New York constituted organization, and Africa is all the way out there. You know, from the perspective of everyone, you know, what is SNF doing in New York? But in terms of how we worked on the ground, we had to borrow experience from the sickle cells group, because there are organizations here that are constituted here but are doing work out there. How does that work? How is it organized? HIV is huge. I was having dinner yesterday with James from Helmsley, and we were talking about this. Like, there's such experience to be borrowed across these organizations, and actually bringing them together as either grantees or people who are doing work to just learn and borrow. Meeting Sneha and learning about her peer-to-peer support. I mean, I think it's invaluable. Transferable experience and just learning from people who've done it is incredible. And I think even Josh, I mentioned, Chordoma, where you were 15 years ago, is likely where SNF is now in Africa. Yeah. So a lot of borrowed and borrowing experiences.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're almost at time, but I guess from my perspective, you know, our program would be nowhere without people that we've met, mentors that have like given me 30 minutes of their time, whether that's in higher education. We've worked with some coalitions that have no sort of interest or experience in chronic illness, and just learning from how they've mobilized and created sort of advocacy spaces has been monumental. I will also say at Generation Patient, we are one of the very few patient advocacy groups that is independent of all industry. So that includes pharmaceutical industry, you know, hospital and insurance industry, and so we're very proud of that. But developing that model has been one of the most challenging things, because, you know, everywhere we go as an organization, we're grassroots, we're patients, we have to sustain ourselves. But at the same time, how can we do so with also being able to keep our voices at the forefront as patients? And, you know, when we engage in policy, how are we able to do so without, you know, feeling like we have some sort of strings attached? And so I think that's been a really interesting model, and I've learned so much from some of the amazing policy organizations out there. I will say mutual aid organizations are my favorite type of organizations. They do really organic work. They're, you know, very active on social media. You look at mutual aid diabetes, you know, they're, you know, finding ways to get each other insulin. It's just, it's really incredible. So yeah, it was a long-winded answer, but there's a lot of people that have really supported us. So.
Yeah, completely echo that. You know, along the way, it's become very clear that every disease faces a similar set of challenges that require a similar set of solutions. And so there are all these organizations out there that are blazing parallel paths for similar diseases. We've benefited extraordinarily from the experiences of other disease-specific organizations, and similarly try to pay it forward as much as possible. So in fact, next week I'm doing an Ask Me Anything webinar, because there's, you know, more and more patient organizations or patients who are considering starting organizations who are kind of coming to us for advice and guidance. And you know, I always try to, you know, to pay it forward. But I have to say, you know, having been at the Rare as One conference a couple weeks ago, it's just really, really striking how those organizations, by being a part of that community, are kind of traveling up the learning curve and the development curve so much faster than we were able to. I mean, they're accomplishing what, you know, took us 5 or 10 years in the span of just a couple years. So I think there's a lot of power in bringing patient groups together and, you know, sharing knowledge and not having to reinvent the wheel over and over again.
Questions from the audience? Over here.
Hi, my name is Eric Gosho. I'm with a group called the National Health Council, and thank you so much for such a wonderful panel. This is my first time at this festival, and I've heard a lot of really interesting talks from, you know, pharmaceutical executives, hospital executives, digital health tool entrepreneurs, and I heard a lot of really great, amazing work that they're doing. But the one thing that I've rarely heard at this conference is the important insights that they can get from folks like you and from the patient community. And, you know, we've done so much work around the power of patient engagement, and I feel like it's kind of become a Washington buzzword. It's, you know, really important, the patient-focused drug development program, et cetera. But to not hear it really much at this conference just shows how much more work we need to do to really push the private sector in that area. So really curious to know, and, you know, to Alison's point, not in a tokenistic way, but really creating those opportunities within the private sector to really gain those patient insights and make sure that we're delivering drugs, devices, care delivery models, you know, you name it, really with that lived patient experience. So curious sort of the work that you've done in that area with the private sector, and what more can we in the patient community do?
That's a great
I can
question.
go first.
Yeah, Sneha, I think Josh, you probably have something to say to that too, for sure.
Yeah, so first of all, I really appreciated Alison's point about tokenism. So just for very, very quick background, when I was 18, I used to actually do some consulting with the pharmaceutical industry. And so I've had sort of both sides to that experience of working on drug affordability issues, but also working alongside the pharmaceutical industry. And one thing that I think is really, really important that I think that we cannot miss is the conversation about affordability of these medical products, of these devices, of these therapeutics, because I think we often have these conversations after the therapeutics come to market. And what's so frustrating to me is that, I am with the community of young people who are going to be paying thousands and thousands of dollars for their medical products, which they cannot live without. And so, one thing for me, Eric, I think is, while we're at the table and while we include more patients in these conversations, that we also have the opportunity to think more proactively in terms of long-term, and not just the experience right now, but also kind of the holistic side of being a patient.
Yeah, please.
I mean, my work isn't necessarily U.S. focused, but I certainly understand the experience. But I think in general, programming work that we do has got to, at every stage of the program, soup to nuts, involve the patient. And so I think if on our sides as organizations, patient-led organizations, can remember that and advocate for that, I think in the end, the tokenism part of things and health equity, I mean, we were just, talking about how, the conversation this morning, there's gaps, but I think in the end, we have a responsibility to ensure that in all our work, our programming, our conversation central to that is that without the patient, you got nothing. And so therefore then, there's some symbiosis there somehow.
So I think it's a really interesting question because it's framed from the perspective of the way that research is currently organized, namely that research is driven by academia and industry. And if you really zoom out and ask, is that the optimal way for research to be organized? As I was alluding earlier, if you think about who has the greatest incentive, who has the most skin in the game to ensure that the problems get solved, that treatments get developed, it's those who are affected by the disease, those who stand to benefit. And so I think that in many ways the onus is on us to not be engaged by doctors, researchers, pharmaceutical companies, but to drive research, to set the agenda. And the reality is that companies will do what is in their business interest. And so to the extent that we can make it in their business interest to engage with patient communities or work with patient communities or work on a particular disease area, then I think they will follow their interest. So I think there's a lot more that can happen and kind of a completely different set of plays that are possible, so to speak, when patients are on the playing field as opposed to kind of cheering from the sidelines or being engaged by the research community.
If I could just build on that. So something that the Patient-Led Research Collaborative is doing now, we got some funding and we're assembling a team of patient experts to review research and administer the funds based on how those patient experts see fit. That's an example of us actually being on the playing field, not sitting on the sidelines saying, hey, we think you should do this, and then they go in a completely different direction because patients are choosing what is actually funded. And to your point about business interests, with long COVID, there's some data out just yesterday from the National Center for Health Statistics. 1 in 5 adults in the US with COVID infections and 1 in 13 of all adults in the US have long COVID. This is a business interest. This is a workforce issue. So we need money to get treatments going and to start improving quality of life while those treatment clinical trials get going.
Those are just astounding statistics. It's really...
Yeah, 1 in 5 of all adults that have COVID and 1 in 13 of every adult in the US have long COVID.
We have a minute left. Is there one last question that we could answer really quickly? Then how about this? How about we go down the line, say something about what's next for each of you. What are you looking, what's sort of one of your next things that you want to tackle, take on? What are you looking forward to with your work?
I can go. For us, it's
20 seconds each.
Very clearly, it's scaling up our lab and being able to drive research ourselves, as well as empower many more researchers to take advantage of that infrastructure.
Yeah, I think related to this panel specifically, I'm really, really excited about our regulatory work and trying to really promote the adolescent young adult patient perspective. In addition, I would love to partner with like some more NIH grants and that sort of thing to really drive some more research in the future and really have that at the forefront and partner with other patient communities, because I think that's key even in that inflammatory bowel disease space, is to really have others kind of together and do a lot of this research together. So that's what I'm really looking forward to.
Us, I think digital health. Africa is, 65% rural, and I believe that there's space for technology, digital health somehow. Not sure how, but the journey to that will happen. The second thing that I think is extremely important to SNF is a data repository. There is no scope, scale, nobody knows. And so if we can, build on that, because that's the foundation to research, meaningful research on the continent, therapies and treatments that make sense, and the policy environment, influencing the policy environment comes down to data. And if we can do that, I'll have done my job.
I think what I'm excited about is the invitations that we're getting to meaningfully engage. We've been, working with the CDC, the NIH, and various other important entities to inform them on long COVID. That statistic I just cited, our team helped them develop their language on how they were asking people if they were experiencing long COVID, which symptoms and things like that, to make sure it was capturing the accurate patient experience. So I'm excited for our team to have seats at very important tables and to actually be listened to when we're at those tables.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Alison, Vivian, Sneha, Josh, for bringing the patient voice to this panel, but more importantly, more broadly, to the Aspen Health Conference. I am just thrilled by this. The conversation has just been an amazing one for me, and I hope for the audience. And thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of the conference.